In NBA history, Joe Dumars was not the loudest name, but he was one of the most enduring and respected icons the league ever produced. Wearing the Detroit Pistons jersey throughout his entire career from 1985 to 1999, he became a pillar in the famous Bad Boys era, playing a major role in bringing the team to two consecutive NBA championships in 1989 and 1990. His individual peak came in 1989, when he was honored as Finals MVP, following outstanding and steady performances in the most critical moments. Dumars was also selected to the All-Star team 6 times, appeared on multiple all-defensive teams of the league, and scored more than 16,000 points in his career, a number that reflected durability more than showmanship. He was famous for his disciplined defense, especially in matchups against Michael Jordan, where he was regarded as one of the few guards who could truly give this legend a hard time. After retiring, Dumars continued to make his mark in an executive role, building the Pistons roster that won the NBA championship in 2004 and earning Executive of the Year honors in 2003. In 2006, he was inducted into the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame, and his number 4 jersey was permanently retired in Detroit as an irreplaceable symbol. But behind those titles was not an easy or emotionally complete life, but a long journey of endurance and near absolute discipline. From the early days in Louisiana, where he grew up in silence and deprivation, to the years of playing in a harsh environment, Dumars always had to shoulder every pressure by himself, without showing it on the outside. In a lineup famous for its aggressiveness, he chose to keep himself composed, not loud, not reactive, but that also gradually made him stand outside even when he was at the center. The high-stakes games, the intense defensive plays, the constant collisions left marks on his body, but he never turned that into a story to tell. After retiring, the pressure did not disappear, but simply shifted to another form, when he had to make decisions that affected an entire organization and face criticism while still keeping silent the way he always did. Perhaps the hardest thing was not playing or winning, but the fact that he never allowed himself to collapse, never let the world see what he had to endure. And that very thing created a person whose willpower was so strong that it was almost lonely. Before continuing into the journey behind the silence of Joe Dumars, please hit subscribe and leave a like as a quiet way to acknowledge a person who dedicated his entire life without needing to be seen. In Louisiana during those years, life was not measured by dreams, but by days that could pass without collapsing. Joe Dumars grew up in an environment where opportunities did not come ready-made, where children did not have many choices other than learning to adapt to reality on their own. There were no modern basketball courts, no coaches following every step, no one standing beside him to say he could become something greater. What he had was only dusty roads, simple courts, and a life where each day demanded resilience more than emotion. His family was not lacking in love, but it was a quiet kind of love, overshadowed by practical worries. When adults had to focus on maintaining life, listening to a child's sadness became something that could not be prioritized. There were no long conversations about feelings, no hugs long enough to soothe every insecurity, only the steady continuation of similar days, where each person found their own way to get through their part. In that space, a child very easily learned not to bother others with his emotions, very easily understood that silence was the best way to exist. Dumars was not the name everyone mentioned when talking about young talent in the neighborhood. He did not draw attention, did not stand out, did not make anyone stop to observe. Other children might be praised, might be called by name, while he was usually just there, like part of the scenery that no one really focused on. Gradually, that feeling no longer bothered him, but became something he accepted. When a person got used to not being seen, they also stopped trying to step into the light. They learned to stand on the edge, where there were fewer gazes, fewer expectations, and also less hurt if things did not go as hoped. Basketball entered his life not like a big dream, but like a small space where he could control something. On the court, no one asked who he was, no one cared where he came from. Only how he moved, how he handled the ball, how he read the situation. But even there, he did not immediately become the center. There were no big crowds, no lights, no cheers. Only long afternoons where he repeated movements, adjusted every small detail, tried to get a little better each day without anyone watching. What was special was not that he was more talented than others, but that he did not stop even when no one saw him. There were evenings when everything felt heavy, when the feeling of being forgotten returned, and he had no one to share with, no one to say everything would be okay, no one to remind him he was on the right path. And in those moments, he learned something that would follow him for the rest of his life. If no one was there to lift you up, you had to do it for yourself. That was not a choice, but a survival skill. As the years passed, the silence was no longer imposed from outside, but became part of who he was. He no longer waited for attention, no longer needed words of recognition to keep trying. He learned to evaluate himself by his own standards, standards that did not depend on others' eyes. This made him stronger, but at the same time it also created a distance. When you are not used to being seen, you also do not know what to do when the light really shines on you. When you are not used to being listened to, you also do not know how to speak what you feel. And Joe Dumars carried all of that when he stepped out of Louisiana. From the outside, it was a calm, well-controlled person who was not easily shaken. But deep inside, it was a child who had learned to endure alone too early. A person who had gotten used to standing alone even when there were many people around. No one saw the moments he doubted himself. No one knew how much he had to try to feel he had value. Because he never spoke it out, and perhaps the saddest thing was not that he was not noticed when he was young, but that he grew up and continued to live that way, as if silence was the only thing he could trust. In a world where many people crave to be seen, Joe Dumars learned to exist without needing that, and that very thing shaped who he became. A person strong in a way few recognized, but also lonely in a way almost no one understood. That silence did not stop when Joe Dumars grew older, but continued to follow him in the first years when he took basketball more seriously, where it should have been the beginning of opportunities. But for him, it was just another road full of limitations. There were no famous academies, no well-designed training programs, no teachers ready to guide every step. So he stepped into this world almost alone, with the little that the surrounding environment could provide. The courts where he trained were not places that produced big stars. There were no lights, no spectators, only old surfaces and long afternoons that stretched until dark, where he repeated movements without anyone correcting mistakes, without anyone saying whether he was doing it right or wrong. Everything had to be felt, adjusted, and learned from failures without explanation. In a world where many progressed through guidance, he progressed by groping in the dark on his own. When he began facing other players, the gap between him and those who were better trained became clear. They were faster, stronger, more confident, and most importantly, they were seen. Other names were mentioned, noticed, expected, while he remained just someone standing in the back, doing what needed to be done, but not enough to make anyone stop and observe. The comparison did not need to be spoken. It was present in every look, every choice, every opportunity given to others, but not to him. And over time, that no longer bothered him but became part of how he saw himself. He no longer waited to be called by name, no longer expected any moment to change everything. Instead, he began to build a different approach. If he could not be the one noticed, then become the one who could not be eliminated. There were no big leaps, no performances that made crowds explode, only stability, discipline, and an almost absolute level of focus on the smallest details. He learned to read the game, not through natural instinct but through observation and memory. Learned to move not through explosion, but through precision. Day after day, he built himself in a way that no one really noticed, because nothing in it was big enough to draw immediate attention. But that very thing created a foundation that later was not easy to break. There were nights when he left the court in silence, with no one telling him he had played well, no one patting his shoulder or acknowledging him, only the feeling that he had done everything he could and that had to be enough. In his world, recognition was not a reward, but a luxury he could not rely on. And when a person stopped seeking recognition, they also began to change the way they existed. Joe Dumars no longer tried to stand out. He tried to last longer, stand firmer, endure longer. That sounded simple, but in an environment where everyone wanted to be noticed, accepting to stand outside the light required a level of discipline not everyone had. Gradually, he formed a mindset that would later follow him throughout his career. Not being recognized did not mean having no value, but at the same time, that also brought a consequence he could not avoid. When a person got used to not being seen, they also would not know how to step forward when the real opportunity came. They would continue to keep themselves in the back, continue working in silence, even when they deserved more than that. And Joe Dumars carried that into the next stages of his life. What he built in this period was not fame, but a person. A person who could endure without anyone knowing, who could move forward without anyone cheering, who could exist in a world that always favored those who were louder. But behind it all, there was still a truth not easy to face. Learning to exist without being noticed could make a person stronger, but it could also make them forever feel they did not truly belong anywhere. And perhaps that was what began very early in his life. Not a lack of opportunities, but the fact that he had gotten used to not seizing them the way others did. The years in Louisiana taught Joe Dumars how to exist without needing to be seen. But when he stepped into the college environment at LSU, he began to face another truth that was even harder to accept. Even when he had gone farther, had played better, he still did not become the name people mentioned first. On the LSU basketball court, Dumars was not lacking. On the contrary, he played consistently, effectively, and gradually became one of the important players on the team. But media attention did not turn toward him. The lights, the articles, the big stories always revolved around names with more standout styles, people who could create moments that made spectators stand up, while he, with his calm and disciplined style of play, was easily overlooked in short reports. There were games where he played excellently, nights where he kept the rhythm for the whole team. But when everything ended, people still turned to other names to praise. Gradually, this feeling was no longer unfamiliar, but became a familiar part of his journey. Doing his job well but not being called by name. When facing top players, especially explosive talents like Michael Jordan, the difference became even clearer. People like Jordan carried light, carried natural attention, while Dumars carried stability and discipline, things not easily seen right away. He did not have plays that made the arena explode, did not have moments that made the media stop to retell. And precisely because of that, even though effective, he still stood in the back in the way the world perceived him. When the NBA draft came, that was clearly reflected. He was not a top choice. Not a name teams fought over, but only a selection in a modest position, a decision more supplemental than building the future. Being chosen by the Detroit Pistons was an opportunity, but also a reminder that he was still not seen as the center of any big plan. For many, that could be a disappointment. But for Dumars, it was just the continuation of what he was used to, starting from the back and advancing on his own. The early days in the NBA did not bring emotional change. He still had to prove himself little by little. In every practice, every minute of play, every small opportunity given. There was no favoritism, no protection, no comfortable time to adapt. Every mistake could push him back. Every mistake could push him back. Every missed opportunity could be replaced by someone else. And in that environment, he continued to do the only thing he knew: stay silent and work. Not to impress, but to not be eliminated. Initial success eventually came, But it did not bring the complete feeling many still imagined. Better numbers, better games, a more solid position in the lineup, all were clear steps forward. But inside, the feeling of not enough was still there, not because he lacked ability, but because he had never learned to see himself through others' eyes. When you have gotten used to not being recognized, then even when success comes, you will not feel it the way others do. There were moments when he could have stopped to feel proud, but he continued moving forward as if everything was still not finished. There were achievements that others would celebrate, but for him, they were only part of the job that needed to be done even better. And that very thing created a very large gap between the way the world saw him and the way he saw himself. For others, he was advancing, getting better, building an impressive career. But for himself, that journey was still not enough to fill the feeling that had existed for a very long time. The feeling that he needed to do even more, be even better, prove even more, even though no one required it. And perhaps that was one of the hardest things he had to carry. Not being underestimated, but having accepted that for so long that it became the standard for himself. When a person always feels they are not enough, they will never stop. But they will also never truly feel they have arrived. And Joe Dumars, in those years, began to step into such a journey where every step forward came with a void not easy to fill, a journey where success was not the endpoint but only a reason to continue trying in silence. When Joe Dumars stepped into the Detroit Pistons locker room, he did not enter a normal team, but a world where every rule was rewritten by contact, where softness was not an option, and where survival was decided by the ability to endure more than pure talent. This was the period when the Pistons were gradually forming the bad boys identity, a collective that not only played basketball but fought in every play, every breath, every look. The players around him carried a completely different energy, strong, fierce, sometimes rough enough to make anyone stepping in hesitate. In that environment, Dumars's calmness and discipline were not an immediate advantage, but sometimes made him feel out of place. He was not someone who liked unnecessary contact, not someone who sought conflict, not someone who used emotion to overpower opponents. But on that court, if you were not tough enough, you would be swallowed before you could prove anything. And that was when he had to face a difficult choice: stay true to himself or change to survive. There was no one sitting down to explain that to him, no one saying outright that he needed to become different, but he could feel it in every practice, in every game, in every collision he was not used to. The pushes, the uncompromising battles, the moments when the line between basketball and a fight became blurred, all were lessons he had to learn the hardest way, with his own body. There were days he left the court with pains no one mentioned, fatigues no one shared, and quiet questions about whether he truly belonged here. But leaving was never an option. He had come too far to turn back, and he understood that if he wanted to survive, he had to find a way to adapt without completely losing himself. Gradually, he began to adjust, not by becoming a completely different version, but by adding what was necessary so he would not be left behind. He learned to accept contact, learned to stand firm in tense situations, learned to face opponents who not only wanted to win, but also wanted to dominate. But the important thing was that he did not lose his control. While many let emotion lead, he kept his clarity. While many reacted with explosion, he reacted with precision. That did not make him stand out immediately, but it made him reliable in a way not everyone recognized. However, the price of that adaptation was not small. Each time he was forced to step closer to his own limit, each time he had to accept a style of play not completely suited to him, was each time he had to give up a small part of himself. No one saw that, because from the outside he was still the calm, controlled Joe Dumars who did not change. But inside, a continuous adjustment process was taking place. A process where he had to balance on his own between surviving and keeping what made him himself. In a team where aggressiveness was the common language, keeping calmness became a challenge no less than facing opponents. There were moments when he could easily react like the others, could let emotion lead, but he chose not to. Not because he could not, but because he understood that if he lost that, he would have nothing left to hold himself together. And that very choice made him different in a collective that was already different from the rest of the NBA. But difference did not always bring a feeling of belonging. On the contrary, it often came with isolation. Dumars was not the center of stories in the locker room, not the one creating loud moments, not the one all eyes focused on. He existed like a point of balance, someone who kept everything from going beyond limits, but that role was rarely spoken, and therefore he continued in his familiar position, there but not completely seen. Even so, he stayed, not because he fit perfectly, but because he understood that sometimes not completely belonging to a place was precisely the way to last the longest in it. And in that collision-filled world, Joe Dumars began to prove something few recognized at the time: that strength did not always come from noise, and to stand firm in a harsh environment. Sometimes the hardest thing was not defeating others, but not losing yourself when everything around was trying to pull you in a different direction. And then, as Joe Dumars gradually stood firm in a harsh collective like the Detroit Pistons, something else began to become clear. He was no longer pushed out, but he had never truly been inside. In a team where personality was expressed through noise, through collisions, through strong reactions on and off the court, Dumars chose a completely different way of existing. He did not raise his voice, did not try to impose himself, did not join the emotional flows swirling around. His calmness was not a strategy to impress, but a part of who he was, something he had carried from the years when no one saw him. But that very thing created a distance that could not always be narrowed. In the locker room, where stories were told through loud laughter, through arguments, through egos colliding, Dumars was often in the back, observing more than participating. No one eliminated him, no one shunned him, but no one really pulled him into the center of those moments. He was present, but in a very different way, like someone standing on the edge of the very collective he belonged to. That was not always easy. When you are part of a team, you not only need to play well, you also need to feel you belong. But for Dumars, that feeling always lacked something, a deep connection he did not know how to build, or perhaps had never learned how to build. He communicated just enough, kept distance just enough, did not let anyone step too deep into his world, and also did not step too deep into others' worlds. From the outside, that was professionalism, control, a perfect image of a disciplined athlete. But inside, it was also a form of isolation that not everyone recognized. The wins began to come, and the Pistons became one of the most formidable teams in the NBA. The lights began to shine on them, the media began to talk about them, and the name Joe Dumars was also gradually mentioned more. But even when standing at the peak, his feeling did not change as much as people thought. Collective success did not automatically turn into personal connection. The trophies, the titles, the historic moments could not fill the void he had carried for a very long time. There were nights after victories, when everyone celebrated, when the locker room was filled with laughter and excitement. Dumars still kept a quiet space for himself, not because he did not appreciate what they had achieved, but because he did not know how to blend into it the way others did. He stood there, witnessing it all, but feeling like he was watching from a certain distance, as if everything was happening around him, but did not completely belong to him. And the farther he went, the clearer that feeling became. When you begin to achieve things that previously seemed impossible, you think everything will change, that the voids will be filled, that the feeling of not enough will disappear. But for Dumars, that did not happen. On the contrary, each step forward made him realize more clearly that there were things that could not be changed by success alone. He became one of the most important players on the team, someone teammates trusted, someone coaches relied on, but the feeling of belonging was still at a certain level, not complete. That did not weaken him, did not make him stop, but it made his journey heavier in a very unique way. Because when you do not completely belong to where you are, you will always have to keep a part of yourself in a defensive state, always have to control, always have to be careful, not because the environment did not accept you, but because you had never really let go to become part of it. And Joe Dumars lived like that throughout his peak years. A person standing at the center of victory, but keeping a distance for himself that no one could cross. What was worth noting was not that he was lonely because he was pushed out, but that he was lonely even when no one pushed him out. And perhaps that was the hardest to recognize form of loneliness, because from the outside, everything seemed perfect. But inside, there was always a silence that no noise could reach. And as the journey continued, as bigger challenges appeared, as pressure increased with each year, that very silence would become the only place he could rely on, but also the place reminding him that no matter how far he had gone, a part of him was still standing alone, just like the way he had stood from the very first days. In the deeper years of his peak, when Joe Dumars had become an indispensable part of the Detroit Pistons, his role gradually became clearer, but at the same time heavier in a way that few truly understood fully. He was not the one assigned to score the flashy points, not the one creating moments that made spectators stand up, but the one placed in direct matchup against the most dangerous players on the court, the names the entire league had to watch out for. Among them, no name brought greater pressure than Michael Jordan, an icon at the peak of his strength, speed, and explosiveness, a player who could change the course of the game every time he touched the ball. Facing Jordan was not just a tactical assignment, but a prolonged challenge, repeated through every game, every season, a war without a stopping point, where every small mistake could be punished immediately. And in all those matchups, Dumars was the one chosen, not because he was the most outstanding, but because he was stable enough, disciplined enough, durable enough not to be swept up in the opponent's rhythm. But the price of that stability was not light at all. Every game was a time the body had to endure contact. Every defensive play was a time he had to put himself in a dangerous position. Every minute of play was a time of expending energy with not many chances to rest. There were no moments to relax, no time to float in the game, because just 1 second of carelessness and the opponent would take advantage right away. That made his role become a prolonged burden, not just in one game, but throughout many consecutive years. The body began to react in ways he could not avoid. The accumulated pains, the small injuries that never fully disappeared, the mornings waking up with a heavy feeling that no one saw. But he did not talk about it. There were no complaints, no interviews telling about the fatigue, no stories about the price he had to pay. He continued to step onto the court, continued to do his job, as if that was the only thing that needed to be done. And while other names were praised for their points, beautiful plays, decisive moments, Dumars's role lay somewhere else, where it was not easily recognized, where success was measured by the opponent being limited, by the things that did not happen. When Jordan did not have an explosive game as usual, that was Dumars's success. When a star was forced to change the way he played, that was Dumars's mark. But those things were rarely spoken about clearly, because basketball, like many other things, often remembered what was easy to see more than what happened in silence. And he accepted that, not because he did not deserve recognition, but because he had never done this to be praised. His sacrifices were not retold in big stories, did not appear in highlight reels, did not become the topic of heated debates. They existed on another level, where only those who truly understood the game could see them. But even when seen, they did not bring big changes in the way the world looked at him. He was still Joe Dumars, stable, reliable, but not the center of attention. And that, over time, was no longer a surprise, but became part of the journey he had accepted from a very long time ago. What was worth noting was not that he was not praised, but that he had never demanded it. He continued to do the hardest job in the quietest way, continued to face the biggest stars without needing the light to shine on himself. But inside, the price still existed. Not resentment, but wear, not only of the body but of emotion. When a person continuously put himself in tense situations without chances to release, when a person continuously carried responsibility without much recognition, they would gradually change in a way that was very hard to notice. Dumars did not weaken, did not lose his ability, but he became more reserved, more closed off, shared less. What he carried was not stories to tell, but experiences kept inside, not spoken, not released. And perhaps that was what made his journey special in a very unique way, not because he had defeated big stars, but because he had done it in silence, time after time, without needing the world to see. But that very silence also made what he had to endure become invisible. And as the years passed, as the body gradually grew more tired, as the pressure no longer came only from opponents but also from inside himself, he began to carry a burden that no one could share. And that was when the bigger question appeared. When a person spent his entire career stopping the greatness of others, keeping the team standing firm, then who would be the one to keep himself from collapsing when all of that ended? And then, after all those years facing pressure, enduring in silence and carrying the heaviest tasks that few saw, Joe Dumars finally touched the peak that any player would dream of, the NBA championship, when the Detroit Pistons climbed to the throne in 1989 and then repeated it in 1990. That was not only a victory for a collective, but also an affirmation for everything they had built in an environment where no one believed they could succeed that way. And at the center of that moment, Dumars was no longer the name overlooked, like in the years before. He was honored as Finals MVP in 1989, the highest individual honor in the most important games, a recognition that should have brought a complete feeling, should have been the affirmation that every effort, every sacrifice, every silence he had endured finally had meaning. But the strange thing was that when standing at that peak, the emotion did not come in the way people usually imagined. There was no explosion, no intense moments of release, no feeling that everything had been repaid. He celebrated, but not loudly. He smiled, but not for long. He stood there amid the cheers. But some part of him still kept distance from that very moment. For many people, that was the moment that changed everything, the point where all previous pain was erased. But for Dumars, victory did not erase what had existed inside him for a very long time. The trophies could not change the way he saw himself. The titles could not immediately fill the voids that had formed from childhood. When a person had gotten used to not being recognized, they would not know how to receive recognition even when it came. And Dumars was exactly like that. Success came, but he did not welcome it as an endpoint, but as part of a journey that was still not complete. The days after the victory, when the media praised, when fans celebrated, when teammates enjoyed the historic moment, he still kept his rhythm of life almost unchanged. There was no big change in the way he appeared, no clear difference in the way he looked at the world. What many considered the peak for him was like a short stop before continuing forward. And that very thing created a hard-to-understand paradox. A person who had achieved everything but did not feel he truly owned it. Joy came, but did not stay long. The celebrating moments passed, and when everything returned to normal, the familiar silences appeared again. Not disappointment, not regret, but a very light feeling of emptiness. But enough to realize that there were things success could not touch. He continued to play, continued to contribute, continued to keep his role in the team. But inside, there was a change no one saw. When you achieved the greatest thing you had ever pursued, you began to wonder what would come next. And when the answer was not clear, that void became even larger. For Dumars, basketball was not only a job, but the place he found stability in an uncertain world. But when even basketball could not bring a complete feeling, he began to face a much harder question. If success was not enough, then what would be enough? There was no immediate answer, and he did not search for it loudly either. He continued to live the way he always lived, continued to do what needed to be done, continued to keep silence before what was happening inside. From the outside, everything still looked perfect. A champion, an MVP, an icon of discipline and stability. But inside, the journey continued, not to achieve more titles but to search for a feeling he had never truly had, and perhaps that was what made his story different. Not that he had won, but that he had won without ever feeling he had truly stopped. Success did not change him, but it also did not free him. It only brought him to another stage, where the questions became deeper, where the silences became clearer, and where he began to understand that there were things in life that could not be filled by victory, no matter how big that victory was. After all the titles, the trophies, and the moments the world could see, what remained in Joe Dumars's life lay in a completely different place, a space he had never allowed the lights to enter. While many built their image not only through on-court achievements, but also through personal stories, through sharing, through everyday moments made public, Dumars chose the opposite path. He kept almost his entire family life private, did not let personal relationships become topics of discussion, did not turn what belonged to him into part of his fame. For him, there was a very clear boundary between the person on the court and the person outside life. And that boundary was not for decoration, but for protection, not because he had nothing to tell, but because he did not want to tell. Not because he had no emotions, but because he was not used to putting his emotions in front of the world. His interviews were always short, calm, focused on the work more than the person. There were no long stories about childhood, no deep sharings about what he had been through, no moments of weakness revealed. He answered enough to fulfill his responsibility, but never went beyond what was necessary. That made him one of the hardest to grasp figures in a world used to exploiting every aspect of a person. The public knew him as a disciplined player, a reliable leader, an icon of stability. But when the question turned to the real person behind those things, the answer almost always stopped at silence. And that very silence created a distance that not everyone recognized. When a person did not share, others would fill the gap with assumptions. But with Dumars, even those assumptions did not have much basis because he did not leave enough traces for people to speculate. He existed in public perception as an image defined by what he did, not by what he felt. And that, over time, not only became the way the world saw him, but also became the way he existed. The pressures he faced did not disappear when the game ended. They only shifted to another form, less loud but no less heavy. As a player, he carried responsibility on the court. When he became a leader, he carried responsibility for an entire organization. Decisions did not only affect the result of one game, but also the careers of others, the future of a team, the expectations of millions of fans. But unlike many others, he did not share that burden. There were no complaints, no moments of release, no times he revealed how much pressure he was under. He kept everything inside, the way he had done since he was a child. And over time, keeping everything to himself was no longer a choice, but became a habit hard to change. This made those around him, no matter how close, also find it hard to fully understand him. Teammates could trust him on the court. Colleagues could respect him at work, but very few people really knew what he thought when no one was around, what he felt when facing the hardest moments. He did not allow himself to become predictable, did not allow himself to become easily approachable in the way the world expected, and that created a very unique form of loneliness, not the absence of people around, but the absence of anyone truly reaching the deepest part inside. Perhaps for Dumars, that was the necessary price to keep his stability, to not be swept into factors that could derail the path he had chosen. But at the same time, it was also a price that made his life quieter, more private, and in some way harder to reach. When the world looked in, they saw an almost perfect model of discipline and control. But behind that model was a person who had gotten used to carrying everything by himself without needing anyone to know. A person who had learned to live without needing to be understood. And perhaps the sad thing was not that he did not share, but that he had never felt the need to do so. Because when a person had walked too long in silence, they would begin to believe that was the only way to continue. And Joe Dumars, after everything he had been through, chose to continue that way, quietly, privately, and almost without leaving any traces for those who tried to understand the real person behind the titles. And then, after all those years of playing in silence, enduring in silence, and existing in a world he had never truly allowed himself to belong to completely, Joe Dumars made a decision that for him was perhaps natural, but for many was too quiet to the point of being hard to understand. He left. There was no big farewell ceremony, no long media campaign, no emotional statements to mark the end of a career that lasted more than a decade. There were no tears on the court, no long hugs in front of the cameras, no staged moments to etch into fans' memories. He simply stopped, the way he had done with many things in life. Without noise, without explanation, without leaving more traces than necessary. For many athletes, extending the career a few more years, even just to hold on to the spotlight, was a hard-to-resist choice. But Dumars did not follow that path. He did not try to cling to what he had achieved, did not try to extend the image of a legend a little longer in the public eye. He left the court while he still had control over himself, while his body had not completely betrayed him, while he could still play at a certain level without becoming a shadow of himself. That was not an easy decision, because it required accepting to let go before being forced to let go, to leave before the world began to turn away. But for Dumars, perhaps that was the only way he knew, to withdraw while everything was still within reach, instead of waiting until everything went beyond control. What was worth noting was not only the fact that he retired, but the way he did it. There were no long interviews explaining the reason, no stories retold to help the public understand his decision better. He did not say much about how long he had thought about it, what he had considered, how he had felt when facing such a big turning point. He simply stepped through it, as if it was a natural part of the journey, something that did not need to be analyzed or explained too much. And that very silence made his ending different. It was not a big highlight, but an almost unnoticed transition. One day he was still there, on the court, doing what he always did. And then another day, he was no longer there. There was no clear boundary, no moment everyone could point to and say that was when everything ended. Only a gradually expanding silence, until it covered his entire presence in the game he had been attached to for nearly his whole life. For those observing from the outside, that could look like an absence, something not fully closed. But for Dumars, perhaps that was the only way to keep what he needed to keep. When a person had lived too long in a light he had never truly belonged to, leaving that light without making noise could be a way to protect the rest of himself. Not having big farewells also meant not having expectations that needed to be met, not having emotions that needed to be shown, not having moments that needed to become symbols. He left in the way he had lived, controlled, disciplined, and keeping everything within his own limits. But behind that control, there was no lack of emotion. It was just that those emotions were not placed outside. No one knew how he felt in the final days on the court. No one knew what he thought when he stepped out of the locker room for the last time as a player. No one knew whether he felt relief or regret or emptiness, because he did not say. And perhaps that very thing made his ending carry a special tone, not a climax but a settling down, an ending not marked by applause but by silence, an ending not retold through big stories but by the fact that no more stories were told. And when everything had passed, when the court continued without him, when new names appeared and new stories were written, Joe Dumars became part of the past in the way he always was, without noise, without taking attention, but still existing there, in what he had left behind. And perhaps that was not only the way he left, but also the way he chose to end the most important chapter in his life. A chapter that did not need to be closed with noise, because for him silence had always been enough. The silence did not end when Joe Dumars left the court. It only changed shape, becoming heavier in a way few could see, because when he stepped into the executive role with the Detroit Pistons, he no longer carried the pressure of every play, every game, but began to carry something else deeper and longer-lasting: responsibility for an entire organization, for dozens of people, for decisions whose consequences could not be fixed by just the next game. On the court, mistakes could be redeemed. A bad play could be forgotten after a few minutes. But in management, a wrong decision could last for years, even shape the future of a team. And Dumars, the way he had always lived, did not share that burden with anyone. He took on the new role with the same calmness, the same disciplined approach. But this time, his silence was not only a personal choice, but became part of the way he led. He was not the type to stand in front of the media to explain every step, not the one seeking support through words, but the one who made decisions in quiet and accepted all the consequences that came with them without needing to justify. The early days in the new role did not bring the relief many might think. There were no more direct games, no more moments where he could control the outcome himself. But the pressure did not decrease at all. It only became harder to grasp because he had to trust others, had to place faith in players, coaches, the choices he had made. And for a person who had gotten used to taking responsibility himself, delegating like that was not easy. But he still did it, still continued forward in the only way he knew, without hesitation, without showing off, without seeking recognition. The years after that were a slow but pressure-filled process of building. He did not have the advantage of a ready-to-dominate roster, did not have big superstars to rely on, and did not have an easy road to follow. Every decision needed careful consideration. Every step could be questioned. But Dumars did not change his way of doing things. He continued to observe, continued to analyze, continued to place faith in the values he had built since he was a player: discipline, collective, durability. And then, in 2004, all of that converged into an achievement few had predicted. The Pistons won the NBA championship, not through the explosion of an individual, but through a carefully built collective, each piece placed in the right position, each role performed with precision. That was not only a victory for the team, but also confirmation for the way Dumars had chosen, a way without noise, without showmanship, but effective in its own unique way. However, just like what had happened in his playing career, success did not bring complete release. The championship did not lighten the burden, but on the contrary, made it bigger. When you had reached the peak, expectations did not decrease, but increased. Each season after that carried the pressure to repeat, to maintain, to prove that success was not a temporary moment. And for Dumars, that meant he had to continue making even harder decisions in an increasingly demanding environment. Not every decision was right. Not every choice brought the desired result. And when mistakes appeared, they could not be hidden. The media began to ask questions, fans began to doubt, and the name Joe Dumars, once honored, now began to be examined from a different angle. But his reaction did not change. There were no justifications, no efforts to regain his image through words, only the familiar silence. He accepted what came to him the way he always did, keeping everything inside and continuing to do his job. That made him a very different kind of leader, not the one who inspired through words but through taking responsibility, not the one seeking support, but the one who accepted both support and criticism without changing the way he existed. But the price of that way of living was not small. When you did not share pressure, you also had no place to release it. When you did not explain, you also had to accept being misunderstood. And over time, those things accumulated, forming a burden no one could see clearly, but that was always present. Dumars continued to work, continued to make decisions, continued to carry responsibility, but inside that journey did not get lighter but became heavier with each year. And perhaps what made his story special was not that he had succeeded in the new role, but the way he had done it, without changing who he was, without trying to become a different version to fit expectations, but continuing to live the way he had chosen from a very long time before. A quiet way, consistent, and accepting that there were burdens that did not need to be seen to be real. But then, just like every long journey would reach a harder stretch, the final years in Joe Dumars's leadership role began to carry pressures that could no longer be covered by previous success. After the 2004 championship with the Detroit Pistons, expectations not only increased but almost became a fixed standard, that the team had to continue winning, had to maintain its position, had to prove that success was not a rare moment. But basketball, like life, did not operate according to linear expectations. Decisions made with faith and careful calculation did not always bring the desired results. The roster changed, form fluctuated, the pieces no longer fit as before, and gradually questions began to appear. Personnel decisions once seen as bold were now looked back on with skepticism. Strategic steps once praised were now analyzed as mistakes. In an environment where results were the only measure, the past was no longer a guarantee for the present, and Dumars, who had once been respected almost absolutely, began to face a different reality. He was no longer just the one making decisions, but also the one who had to take responsibility for unsexfusable decisions. The media no longer mentioned him with pure respect, but began to ask questions, began to analyze, began to compare between what had been achieved and what was happening. The headlines no longer carried a tone of honor, but gradually shifted to doubt. Fans, who had once trusted the way he built the team, also began to lose patience. And in all of that, what was worth noting was not the change in circumstances, but the way he reacted. Or, more precisely, the way he did not react. Dumars did not step out to explain every decision, did not try to protect his image in front of criticism, did not try to change the story with strong statements. He kept silent, the way he always did. But this time, that silence was no longer seen as calmness, but sometimes understood as a lack of transparency, as a gap that others could fill with their own guesses. When a person did not speak, others would speak for them. And in the modern media environment, those gaps were quickly filled by stories that did not always reflect reality. Dumars became the subject of analyses, debates, judgments he did not participate in. His image in the public eye gradually changed, not because he changed, but because the way others looked at him changed. From a respected person, he became a person who was questioned. From an icon of stability, he became a figure that needed to be reevaluated. And that happened not in one moment, but gradually, step by step, like the way light faded when day turned to night. What made this period difficult was not only the criticism, but the fact that he had to accept it without the need to argue back, not because he had no answers, but because he did not choose the way to answer. That was a choice that could come from the belief that his work would speak for itself, or from the habit formed from a very long time. The habit of not explaining, not justifying, not seeking sympathy. But in a world where everything was analyzed publicly, that silence was not always protective for him. It made him become a figure that others could define the way they wanted, an image that no longer completely belonged to him, but to the way it was retold. And Dumars, instead of trying to regain control of the story, accepted that. He continued to work, continued to make decisions, continued to exist in his role without changing his approach. That showed a rare consistency, but at the same time placed him in a more isolated position. When you did not explain, you also did not create bridges. When you did not react, you also could not adjust the way others understood you. And over time, the gap between his real self and the image the public saw grew larger. But perhaps for Dumars, that was not the most important thing. He had not built his career based on others' recognition, and he also did not adjust himself to fit the changes in how others perceived him. He kept his own path, even when that path became lonelier. And perhaps that was what made his story carry a different tone. Not the story of a person losing respect, but the story of a person continuing to exist without depending on it. But that did not make this period any lighter, because when a person had gotten used to carrying responsibility in silence, continuing to do that in the context of being misunderstood only made the burden heavier. No one saw the full picture, no one understood everything happening behind the scenes. But the evaluations were still made, and he still had to live with them. And in all of that, Joe Dumars did not change the way he existed. He did not step out to tell his own story, did not try to fix the way others saw him, but continued to walk in silence. A silence that was no longer just a choice, but had become an inseparable part of who he was. And then, as the years passed, as the voices outside gradually became louder while inside he still kept the familiar silence, the price of always keeping everything to himself began to become clear in a way that could not be measured by titles or failures. Joe Dumars had never been someone who easily showed emotion, had never stepped in front of the public to talk about what he was going through, had never let moments of weakness become part of the image others saw. From the very first days in Louisiana, when he learned to exist without needing to be listened to the peak years in the NBA, and even when stepping into the leadership role, one principle seemed never to change: control. Not only control of the game, not only control of decisions, but control of himself. Every thought, every reaction, every emotion. In a world where emotion was often seen as a weakness, especially in a harsh competitive environment, his ability to stay calm became an advantage. But over time, that advantage gradually turned into a burden. Because when a person did not allow himself to express, he also did not allow himself to release. The pressures did not disappear. They only accumulated, layer by layer, through each year, through each stage of life. The tense gains, the physical collisions, the expectations to maintain form, the life or death decisions when leading, all left traces, not on the surface, but inside. And because there was no place to share, no space to let go, those traces were never truly erased. They stayed, quietly but persistently. From the outside, Dumars might still be the image of a person with perfect control, someone not shaken, not affected by the changes around. But inside, maintaining that state required a level of energy that not everyone could imagine. Every time he kept silent when he could speak up, every time he stayed calm when he could react, every time he continued to move forward when he could stop, was a choice. And when those choices repeated over decades, they were no longer separate moments, but became part of the structure of the person. Dumars did not only control emotion in big situations, but in the smallest details of life. He did not show fatigue, did not show doubt, did not show the moments when he might not be sure about himself. That created an image that was almost without cracks, but at the same time made any crack that appeared have nowhere to go. There was no one he could tell that he was tired, no one he could admit to that he was under pressure, no one he could simply let go of the role he had held for too long. And over time, not having a place to share became a form of isolation much deeper than not being noticed, because when a person was not noticed, they could still find someone. But when a person did not allow himself to share, he created a distance that no one could cross. The accumulated pressures did not always manifest clearly. They did not always turn into explosive moments, did not always lead to big decisions, but often existed like an invisible weight, making everything a little heavier, a little slower, a little more difficult. And because Dumars never talked about them, no one really knew how big they were. There might be nights he sat alone, not because there was no one around, but because there was no one he could tell what he was thinking. There might be moments he wondered whether everything he had done was worth the price he had to pay. But that question was never spoken out loud. It only existed, like so many other things in his life, in a place no one could reach. What was worth noting was not that Dumars had no emotions, but that he had learned not to depend on expressing them, and that helped him stand firm in many situations where others might collapse. But at the same time, it also made his journey lonelier, because no one could share a burden they did not know existed. When a person always kept everything inside, they not only kept the pain, but also kept the joys. They did not allow themselves to fully sink into any emotion, because that could make them lose the control they had built. And over time, the line between control and suppression became blurred. Dumars continued to move forward, continued to do what he needed to do, continued to exist the way he had chosen from a very long time ago. But the price of that did not lie in what others could see, but in what he had to carry without ever putting down. And perhaps that was the hardest part in his story. Not what he had overcome, but what he had kept, what he had not said, and what he had accepted to carry alone, from beginning to end. Then there came a time when the pressures had accumulated long enough, and the silence was no longer just a choice, but had become a familiar state. Joe Dumars began to move away from everything in a way that he himself seemed to have prepared for a very long time. Without resistance, without clinging, without leaving any sign that he was trying to hold himself in place. There was no sudden decision, no clear turning point, only a gradual change in the way he appeared, in the frequency with which his name was mentioned, in the growing distance between him and the spotlight. The interviews became fewer, the public appearances became rarer, and then almost disappeared completely. In a world where many people tried every way to maintain their presence to ensure they were not forgotten, Dumars went in the opposite direction. He did not try to return to the center, did not join the big conversations, did not use his past to keep the attention. He did not rewrite his story in a more appealing way, did not adjust his image to fit the new era, did not try to become part of the flow he had once helped create. Instead, he let everything pass, as if being mentioned or not no longer mattered. This was not indifference, but a form of acceptance. After everything he had been through, from the years of not being noticed to the periods of having to prove himself, to the peaks and then the doubts, perhaps he understood that attention was not something that could be kept forever, and it was not something that defined a person's value. He did not fight against the silence, but let it come naturally, as an inevitable part of the journey. Those who had once followed him began to realize that the name Joe Dumars no longer appeared in the big debates, no longer was the topic of analyses, no longer placed next to new generations as a point of comparison, not because he no longer deserved it, but because he was no longer there to be mentioned. And what was special was that he did not try to change that. There were no efforts to come back, no steps to rebuild his image, no reminders about what he had done. He let the past stay behind without trying to carry it along to maintain a place in the present. This created a very different feeling, not a legend being pushed out, but a legend who stepped out on his own without anyone asking. In that withdrawal, there was no clear bitterness, no sign of regret shown on the outside. But that did not mean there were no emotions. It was just that those emotions, like so many other things in his life, were not placed on the surface. He did not tell how he felt when he was no longer the center, did not speak about whether he missed the days before or not. He did not create a story to explain his disappearance, and precisely because of that, that disappearance became more complete, more whole, like a natural part of who he was. When a person had gotten used to not needing to be seen in order to continue living, not being seen anymore was not a shock, but only a continuation. Dumars did not lose anything he had never relied on. He did not lose a role he had never considered the center of himself, and therefore, stepping back did not make him smaller. It only made him more distant in the way others perceived him, but that very distance kept who he was, unchanged. not altered by expectations, not pulled along by the need to maintain an image. While the world continued to move forward with new names, new stories, new debates, Joe Dumars gradually became part of the past in a very unique way, not a memory completely forgotten, but a memory not mentioned often. A name that those who truly understood would always remember, but not a name that everyone constantly talked about. And perhaps that was the way he chose to exist in the final part of the journey, not fighting against being forgotten, not trying to change it, but accepting it as part of nature. A legend did not need to be mentioned every day to still be a legend. A person did not need to stand at the center to still keep their own value, and in that quietness, Joe Dumars did not disappear completely. He simply stepped back far enough that the world no longer saw him, but not far enough for what he had done to be erased. And when looking back at that entire journey, from the dusty roads in Louisiana to the peaks of the NBA and then the quiet years behind the lights, Joe Dumars did not appear as a story of big collapses or explosive tragedies, but as a long flow of quiet pressure stretching through each stage, accumulating over the years without ever being put down. He was not the one who collapsed before the world, not the image of a fall that made everyone stop to look, but a person who had gone through everything without allowing himself to break, without allowing the cracks inside to become something others could see. From a child who grew up in deprivation, learning not to need attention, to a player who had to prove his value by himself in a harsh environment, then becoming a champion, a leader, an icon. Each step of his carried a different form of pressure, but the way he faced them was almost unchanged. Without noise, without strong reactions, without seeking sympathy, just simply continuing to move forward. Success did not change him in the way many still imagined. It did not turn him into a different person, did not make him more open, did not make him need recognition more. On the contrary, it only made clearer what had existed before: the discipline, the control, and a silence he always carried. The trophies, the titles, the moments others considered peaks were for him only a part of the journey, not something that defined who he was. And when those successes passed, when the lights gradually dimmed, he did not need to readjust himself, because he had never let that light become the center of himself. The silence, over time, was no longer a reaction to circumstances, but became a way of existing, not avoidance, but a conscious choice, keeping what belonged to him, not letting the outside world shape his entire self. This made him a hard-to-grasp figure, but at the same time created a very unique form of strength. While many people needed to be seen to feel they had value, Dumars existed without depending on that. He did not need to prove himself after each stage, did not need to repeat what he had done to keep a place in others' memories. He let his actions speak for him, and when the actions ended, he accepted that there was nothing more that needed to be said. The legacy he left did not lie in the numbers or the titles alone, even though they were big enough to place him in a respected position in basketball history. That legacy lay in the way he had lived and worked, an almost absolute discipline, an integrity unshaken by circumstances, and an ability to keep himself steady even when everything around changed. In a world where attention often came with change, where people were easily swept up by expectations and pressure, Dumars kept something rare: consistency. He did not become someone else when successful, did not collapse when doubted, did not try to redefine himself when everything changed. He remained the person who had stepped out from Louisiana, only that his journey had become longer, heavier, and deeper. The final image was not a legend surrounded by light, but a person standing in the silence he himself had chosen, not needing to be mentioned to still have meaning. A person who did not let the world see him collapse, not because he had never endured, but because he had learned to endure without needing anyone to witness. And perhaps that was exactly what made Joe Dumars's story special in a very different way. Not the story of what he achieved, but the story of how he kept himself intact throughout that journey. Not that he had never faced pressure, but that he had carried that pressure without letting it define who he was. A life that did not need to prove strength through big moments because the strength had been present in every step, every choice, every silence he kept for himself. And when all had passed, when the story was no longer told every day, what remained was not the noise of the past, but the quietness of a person who had lived fully in his own way. Not perfect, not showy, but steady until the end. The story of Joe Dumars leaves a very quiet feeling of heartache, not because he failed, but because he succeeded, while still carrying so much silence throughout his life. From his childhood in Louisiana, where he learned not to need attention, to the years with the Detroit Pistons when he had to face Michael Jordan directly in the harshest battles, but was still not the name praised the most, all showed a person who always stood at the front line but behind the light. Even when reaching the peak with the NBA championship and the finals MVP title, he still did not have explosive celebrating moments, as if success was not enough to break the layer of control he had built from very early on. Even more painful, when moving to the leadership role and bringing the team to the championship in 2004, he continued to carry pressure in silence. And when criticized in the final years, he also did not speak up to explain, accepting being misunderstood as an inevitable part. That showed a form of strength very worthy of respect, but also made people wonder how much he had to trade to keep that image steady. For American society, where self-confidence and the ability to express oneself are highly valued, Dumars's story is a profound reminder that discipline and integrity are enduring values. But prolonged silence can also become a burden if there is no place to share. The lesson is not to become loud, but to learn balance. To keep oneself steady like Dumars did, but also to allow oneself to be listened to be understood, and to be a complete person, not just a strong icon in others' eyes. If the story of Joe Dumars makes you pause, please hit subscribe and leave a like as a way to honor a person who lived his entire life in silence but never collapsed. Thank you for following, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore the journeys behind the spotlight that not everyone has the courage to tell.